Subscribers to The Australian hear episodes first and get access to all Shari's work on this topic, as well as unrivaled news, politics, investigations, sport and culture. Go to theaustralian.com.au/Wuhan to find out more.
I'm Shari Markson, and I've spent most of the past 2 years investigating the origins of COVID-19.
The Chinese city of Wuhan is under quarantine as the outbreak of the coronavirus worsens.
The federal government has raised its travel advice for the Chinese provinces to Wuhan and Hubei to level 4.
This is the front line of the epidemic in Wuhan, and it is bleak.
I'm declaring a public health emergency of international concern over the global outbreak of novel coronavirus.
What really happened in Wuhan?
Sir Richard Dearlove is an Englishman with a fascinating past. He was a Cold War spy, working behind the Iron Curtain and rising through the ranks of British intelligence agency MI6, where he served as director from 1999 to 2004. It's a role that comes with a single title, C, and made famous by James Bond. As head of MI6, Sir Richard was at the apex of the British establishment. And today he is still very much part of the British intelligence community and has deep links with the academic and political elite. But in June 2020, he was the first establishment figure internationally to raise the possibility COVID-19 may have leaked from a Wuhan laboratory. And he was ridiculed for it. Sir Richard, you were one of the first credible people internationally to come out and say this virus might be a laboratory leak. How were you treated when you made those comments?
Well, I don't spend my time looking at social media, and I'm pretty thick-skinned at my advanced age. I didn't really take much notice. I'm quite used to taking controversial and unpopular positions. I mean, I was the only senior member of the UK intelligence community who was pro-Brexit. Particularly in the University of Cambridge, I got a massive amount of stick for that. And similarly, on this issue, people, well, they treated me with respect, but they poo-pooed my ideas. And I had people saying to me, Richard, my strong advice is you don't get involved in this issue. You know, it's conspiracy theory. You don't want to be seen, as being conspiratorial. And I mean, my reply to them was, if that's what you really think, you haven't really looked at the science. You don't understand the arguments. And I suggest you go back and delve into this a bit more deeply, because you're going to find some pretty strange things when you do. And I was also confident that eventually material would be published which would throw the whole thing into question. I got pretty fed up early on, and obviously, I did alert the government to the existence of these papers and theories. Boy, did I get put-downs, not directly but indirectly from, some very important parts of government who basically were keen that I shut up.
The British government didn't even want to look at this.
I was told that I was peddling conspiracy theories.
Was this by British government or British intelligence?
I'm not going to be specific on that issue. I'll leave it to your imagination, given my past links.
Wow. That must have been so disturbing for you to have played a leadership role at the MI6 and other agencies, a 40-year history, and you can see that they were engaging in gain-of-function research, but yet a Western government, part of the Five Eyes network, didn't even want to look at this.
They didn't appear to, and they seemed to have no interest in pursuing the scientific research or the scientific arguments about the etiology of the virus. Or its sort of biochemical makeup.
In early 2020, Sir Richard was approached by two scientists, Angus Dalgleish and Birger Sorensen, who wanted his advice. They'd written a scientific paper that pointed to a possible laboratory origin of COVID-19, but nobody would publish it.
Well, when it first broke out, I think one had an open mind. I had certainly sat through meetings in my past career where we had worried about the impact of a pandemic. And of course, there were precedents in terms of SARS and other minor outbreaks which never spread. So to begin with, I certainly didn't approach the issue with any sort of suspicion or foregone conclusions. So I was open-minded, okay? However, things began to change as the pandemic evolved. And it was really my association with Gus Dalgleish and Birger Sorensen and the work that they were doing that made me begin to realize that we could be dealing with something which was not a natural outbreak. And of course, if you go back to one of the original SARS outbreaks, I can't remember precisely the details, but there was a problem with a laboratory in Singapore. It seemed to me that one had to look at a range of options which included an escape from one of the Wuhan institutes.
So as you said, you became more intimately involved when your friends who were scientists, Gus Dalgleish and Birger Sorensen, reached out to you. What happened? Why did they contact you?
Because what we rapidly discovered was a huge reluctance on the part of the scientific community in the UK and in the United States to have anything to do with these research papers. Now, they seemed to me to be pretty compelling in terms of their content. And I began to wonder why on earth was such resistance to publication.
Well, it was more than just a reluctance or resistance. It seemed like there was this downright refusal right around the world to publish any science that questioned a natural origin of the virus.
Absolutely right. And, we approached Nature, we approached Science, we approached the American Journal of Virology, we approached various publications in the UK. And it was clear to me that there was a sort of united front not to put anything in the public domain which questioned the Chinese narrative. Even some of these preprint websites which take peer-reviewed articles would not put the article up on their website. So I guess because of my past, this caused me to think much more carefully about what on earth was going on. What made me particularly suspicious was the behavior of Nature magazine, which of course is, or the Nature group of journals. And what I saw was that they were refusing our paper without any scientific grounds. It was purely a refusal to publish. So they weren't challenging the science at the same time as falling over themselves with anxiety to publish anything that supported the Chinese narrative about the pandemic. This made me intensely suspicious.
Well, not only that, but they actually published, I think in March 2020, an unscientific, in my view, basically an opinion piece led by Christian Andersen, which said that this virus could not be a laboratory construct. But in fact, there was no firm evidence within that piece at all to support what they were saying. Yet Nature was happy to publish that, but then rejected scientific papers that did have rigorous work put into it.
So it seemed to me that we were dealing with a situation where there was probably or possibly, I'm not saying we had the evidence for this, significant Chinese manipulation behind the scenes about what should and shouldn't be published. I mean, now we know much more about what happened. And I think the latest revelation, which leaves me with many questions, is the publication after a Freedom of Information request of Fauci's emails in the United States. And it shows that there was a meeting that Fauci convened, which included the UK government scientific advisor, Valence, where what appears to have happened was that a group of scientists agreed that they would actively support the Chinese narrative and suppress any discussion of alternatives. And, this is followed by the famous sort of letter in the Lancet and other publications, which amounted, in my view, to scientific bullying, to really marginalize any alternative views and to make sure that any suggestion that the virus was not zoonotic would be actively suppressed.
This letter, published in the Lancet in early 2020, was signed by 27 leading scientists. It accused those questioning whether the virus was from a laboratory of spreading misinformation. Birger Sorensen and Gus Dalglish needed to rewrite their paper as a vaccine document in order to get it published, and the interest in it was stunning.
It was downloaded 210,000 times. It is completely unprecedented for a scientific article to get that sort of treatment. They usually get 5,000 to 10,000 downloads. So that alerted me and the authors to the fact that they were certainly onto something, and that there must have been many people out there in the scientific undergrowth who realized that there was a problem with the Chinese narrative.
When you put together the picture of the science journals, the role of scientists under Fauci, many of whom, like Peter Daszak, had long-standing relationships, including financial relationships, with the Wuhan Institute of Virology, and then the censorship that unfolded as a result, how disturbing is this censorship? And do you think this all amounted to Chinese disinformation?
Well, Chinese I'm pretty sure that the Chinese, after the outbreak in Wuhan, and they're very good at doing this, sat down and, developed their own information campaign. And this was almost certainly, driven by the Ministry of State Security and run out of the PRC leadership to make sure that, there was suppression of any suggestion that their narrative was not the correct one. And, what concerns me and what worries me is the extent to which the West went along with this. I think part of the problem is that our scientific community over the past 15, 20 years has had a very close relationship with the Chinese scientific community. Now, that could be positive, but it can also be negative. And I think what we've seen are the negative aspects of what happened. And, what I believe has happened is that many of our academic institutions and many of our academic journals have become partially or totally dependent on Chinese funding. Certainly here in the UK now, as a result of this whole business, I know that there is a move centrally in government to look closely at the extent to which our own scientific community has, been subject to a malign Chinese communist influence. And I think we, in future, will have to take very careful steps to control this in terms of registering where Chinese research students go, what their interests are, and take greater steps to protect intellectual property in our universities, particularly in areas of sensitive research. I've been critical about this because of my links with Cambridge and the University of London for a long period. And I've certainly been regarded in a not particularly friendly way by certain academic circles, because I've been warning them that this is a significant problem and that the Chinese state has organized, let's say, rip-offs of our intellectual property in particular.
It wasn't just Chinese disinformation at play. There's another reason much of the media and the scientific community were reluctant to even consider the possibility COVID-19 had leaked from a lab. And that's because of Donald Trump. I wanted to ask you also about another factor that worked to play into the censorship of this discussion, which was the Trump factor. Because a lot of journalists and politicians didn't want to give credence to the idea that the virus might have come out of a laboratory because they thought that would in some way help Trump in an election year.
Yes, unfortunately, you could say that the Trump factor contaminated the argument quite seriously. And I think there were a significant number of prominent scientists who did not want publicly to appear to be supporting Trump. So they had to wait until after the presidential election, as it were, to modify their position. And the letter that appeared in Science magazine, which was signed by David Relman, the professor of microbiology at Stanford, and another 19 eminent American not just American scientists who were largely involved in virology, calling for a transparent debate. But I mean, they wouldn't take that public position until Trump was out of the way and the Biden administration was seen, to be taking, I wouldn't say necessarily a more balanced view, but a more civilized view about the whole issue.
That letter, published in the journal Science in May 2021, was one of 4 open letters signed by internationally renowned scientists insisting that there needed to be an investigation into a possible laboratory leak. Look, let's just turn to the history of the Wuhan Institute of Virology. It was built with the French, but then when it opened, the French weren't welcome anymore. What happened?
Well, I don't know in detail what happened, but it was built by the French and included a cooperation agreement, which meant that French scientists would be included in the research groups in Wuhan and that they would work together on this virological research, i.e. it was research, for the benefit of science generally. According to my contacts in France, the Chinese pretty quickly changed their views, and by the end of 2014, they had effectively excluded all the French that were in the Institute. And this was done, I've talked to 1 or 2 people in France. This was done pretty brutally and without explanation. And, the suspicion on the part of the French was that, that they were pushed out because of the Chinese military interest in the work.
So just another question then on what this might indicate. Why they would want to kick the French scientists out of the laboratory. You mentioned military links. So what could this indicate about some of the research they might have been intending to undertake at the Wuhan Institute of Virology?
Well, the suggestion would be its relevance to biological warfare. But I think one needs to be careful in this area in terms of what one says, because, our own leading research institute has a military dimension, which was Porton Down. But its military dimension is largely defensive, as I understand it, or is defensive, i.e., what protections you can develop. And of course, the dividing line between offensive research and defensive research is not precisely drawn. It goes, but you know as well as I do that there are international conventions on research into biological weapons. It is an area which is highly regulated through the APCW. And certainly in the UK, the capability is a defensive capability. I do not know at the moment, what the overall position is in China, but, there must be a suspicion. I mean, I do know that, and I'm sure you're aware of this, after the Wuhan outbreak, many of the staff in the Wuhan Institute were changed. And they retained some of the staff that had positions in the Communist Party, but the new head of the Wuhan Institute that came in, as it were, after the outbreak was a PRC general who was a woman who was leading expert on biological warfare.
Yeah, Major General Chen Mai.
So, I mean, you can't sort of bring a general in. Okay, you can bring a general in to handle a crisis, but it has to be someone who's familiar with the Institute. So, I mean, that in itself is an indication of the links that existed.
Well, I was actually going to ask you about that. What does that takeover indicate to you?
Well, what it indicates is that they had a crisis in the Institute. And, if you have a crisis and you're the PRC leadership and you want an agency to sort it out, you're going to turn to the PLA, aren't you? Almost for sure. It's the organ that you control most directly. You put the PLA into the Institute to sort out whatever problems there are. I mean, there's a host of circumstantial evidence which points in the direction that this lab was connected with the outbreak of the pandemic. And I mean, I gather now that, there are more and more people who are saying, well, how strange, that the outbreak occurs in the very place, which is in China, which is the very place where viruses are being researched and where they're subject to experimental treatment. I mean, that in itself seems to me, a rather sort of common sense position to start the discussion that we're having.
Absolutely. Not a conspiracy theory, just something logical to examine.
Exactly. So what is so conspiratorial about, making that connection, proximity?
There were a range of other pieces of unusual activity that amount to circumstantial evidence that an incident might have occurred at the Wuhan Institute of Virology. One of these significant pieces of evidence was the so-called blackout at the Institute, where for a 2-week period in October 2019, there was no one present at all at the laboratory. The theory is, although I'm sure you know this better than I do, that there was some sort of mass sterilisation that was taking place, a clean-up of the facility. And this has come in part from satellite overhead data. So, Richard, you've obviously looked into this. What do you think this shows and how significant is it?
Well, I think all these things are hugely significant. There's a whole range of events which point. I mean, these are not evidence as such. I mean, they're not cut and dried, but there's an accumulation of bits and pieces which, contribute to the story that there was a crisis in the Institute, that there was something happening there. And I think to say that these are irrelevant and nothing to do with the pandemic seems to me rather absurd. They point towards that. And look, when you accumulate, there are scientific arguments and there are circumstantial arguments and there are other bits and pieces of evidence. And when you put it all together, you have a rather extraordinary body of material. And I mean, Sherry, I think this is what you have done so successfully. The overall case becomes very, very compelling. I think what we're talking about is reversing the burden of proof in this argument. We have been taking the Chinese narrative at face value unfortunately, with the complicity of our own scientific community, up to a certain point, suddenly that's shifted and changed. And it's changed with good reason. And if you actually look at the evidence, the zoonotic argument is much more unlikely than the escape argument. And it's really up to the Chinese to demonstrate to us clearly that the zoonotic argument is compelling. And you know as well as I do that scientifically they have totally failed to do this. In fact, their repeated failure, their cover-ups, their behavior suggests that the zoonotic argument actually doesn't hold together at all. And I mean, fortunately, we're now in a much more balanced position in looking at this issue.
19 months on.
Yeah, 19 months on, but we have to have an answer. And the reasons that we have to have an answer is, this is the most disruptive global event since World War II. It's turned countries upside down. It's, massively damaged our economies. It's quite apart from the several million people it's killed. It's changed our social lifestyle. And, it has huge implications for the future with relation to all of our national securities.
China's cover-up of the virus is extensive, and Beijing has refused to allow investigators any access to its Wuhan laboratories. It is a totalitarian regime and their instinct is to cover up. But this was beyond any traditional cover-up. The United States Intelligence Community report, released in full in November 2021, said China's cover-up was not diagnostic of a lab leak or any other origin. But Sir Richard disagrees. Is this cover-up more egregious than the way an authoritarian regime would normally behave if there had been some laboratory leak?
Well, I think if it's a laboratory leak, then, an authoritarian government is going to go to great ends to make sure that we all think something different. And that looks very much like what has happened.
I want to ask you this again, Sir Richard. You are the expert in this field. Which of the many pieces of circumstantial evidence do you find the most compelling?
Well, I think the most basic and simple one is, the location of the institute and the nature of the outbreak of the pandemic. Let's not overcomplicate the discussion, but that basic fact as a starting point is in itself a compelling one, which has been studiously ignored by the international community, I guess because it was convenient to do so. But the other issue, which I think is also important, is the sort of obfuscation and difficulty put in the way of a completely transparent investigation by the Chinese PRC authorities. If they had nothing to hide, why are they behaving like that? And if it's zoonotic, they have nothing to hide.
But it's not just China that has something to hide. Remember, American agencies, including the NIH, were funding coronavirus research at the Wuhan Institute of Virology. And they have not been a picture of transparency either. The funding was partly funneled through a subgrant through the not-for-profit group EcoHealth Alliance, run by Peter Daszak. He was the scientist who drafted the Lancet letter and led the scientific resistance to a lab leak. It sounds astonishing, unbelievable, but when the World Health Organization finally got access to Wuhan, Daszak was one of the investigative team sent in to study the origins of COVID-19. He was the only American on the team. Look, I just wanted to ask you about America's role in funding some of the research at the Wuhan Institute of Virology. The funding grants went to some 65 pieces of research, 65 research papers that had US funding from the NIH or the Department of Defense or USAID. Do you think this played a role in the reluctance of some sections of the US government to actually investigate the origins question?
Yeah, I think potentially it's embarrassing for the Americans to have to admit now that there was quite a bit of American money pushed into these research areas. I mean, I think the research had good scientific origins, if you see what I mean. But I mean, given the outcome and the relationship with the Wuhan Institute now, that's, a slightly uncomfortable, well, it's an uncomfortable truth, isn't it?
Well, I mean, that's the problem. There's so much information in the Western world. And, we talk about China lacking transparency and not opening up. But there are people like Peter Daszak who probably have a lot of information. He said he has knowledge of the virus samples and the database. Well, we still haven't been able to get access to that virus database. And Ralph Barrick from the University of North Carolina, Chapel Hill, he'd done gain-of-function research with Xi Jinping. We haven't even found out what information is potentially at our fingertips.
Yeah, well, they should be, they should be submitted to judicial inquiry, whereby they have to reveal this material. I mean, I think we'll get there eventually. And the two you name, Daszak and Barrick, would certainly be at the top of my list for these questions. But I mean, I gather that, Daszak now is sort of recusing himself from future discussion and involvement in this. And given his behavior in relation to the WHO, inspection, I mean, his role has been quite outrageous.
Well, let's talk about that World Health Organization report. It can't even remotely be taken seriously, can it? Given his role with the Wuhan Institute of Virology, his funding of it, his partnership, the fact he's a co-author in so many of the papers with Xi Jinping. It's kind of like China investigating itself, isn't it?
Oh, it's a complete fiasco, the report. But I mean, fortunately, I think now everybody realizes that. But it took a long time for people to get that conclusion. It's 413 pages long, and only 3 pages are devoted to the possibility that we're dealing with a lab escapee. It just takes the zoonotic assumption and attempts to confirm it.
So, Richard, why do you think China might have been doing research that could lead to the creation of a virus that's just so incredibly infectious?
I can't answer that question. But I would say, actually, why would the scientific community? Because, it wasn't just the Chinese. This particular virus, if you look at the etiology of this virus, some of the early experiments were done at Chapel Hill, actually.
Where does the evidence point to in terms of how this virus originated, how it exploded across the planet, both from a circumstantial evidence and a scientific point of view?
Well, the dissemination of the virus, I think, is largely explained by the slowness of the Chinese authorities to come to terms with the outbreak. So there was massive travel out of Wuhan whilst the outbreak was gaining momentum. And for example, I'm sure you're aware, there are close links between Wuhan and northern Italy because of the location of the leather industry and factories in northern Italy, which is an important part of Chinese manufacturing and the Chinese market for Italian leather goods. So it's pretty clear that that outbreak in northern Italy, which as it were was the initial evidence of the seriousness of what we were dealing with, could have been prevented if the Chinese had clamped down earlier and been more honest earlier about the problem that they had on their hands. I don't think there's any question about that at all. So, I mean, quite apart from the issue of the origins of the virus, there's a whole question about, the reaction of the Chinese authorities. And obviously, what's crucially important is the start date. When this actually broke out, how early did it break out? And, how early was it transported internationally to other countries?
How do you think this global pandemic, this crisis of a potential laboratory leak, could impact on Chinese leadership?
Well, my view is that the implications of this for the PRC leadership are severe. Let me put it like this. Most big changes globally are the result of warfare or revolution. So if you look at the sort of historical dividing lines of 1789, 1914-18, 1945, 1848, the lines of history, they have been massively disruptive politically. Now, this pandemic must be equivalent in terms of its disruption globally to our societies, to our economies, to the way we live. It's like 1918 and 1945 in terms of its consequences. The idea that somehow this will have no effect on China because China is so solid, it's an authoritarian regime, I think is very misleading. The idea that, China is on an upward graph of development and, can deal with this and it will just sail on and it will exploit the situation to our disadvantage. I do not subscribe to that view at all.
So what's your prediction for Xi Jinping?
Communist Chinese leadership, as the communist leadership, is extremely brittle. There's no mechanism within the body politic for organizational change. There is no way of flexing. There's no variable geometry. The only change will come about through crisis. And I think Xi Jinping is facing a massive crisis. The idea that, the PRC leadership is solidly behind him, that cannot be the case. There will be factions who are hugely dissatisfied with what has happened, with the way that Chinese reputation is damaged, the way that, China now becomes something akin to an international pariah, particularly in the developing world where most of China's allies sit. So I think the consequences of this will be severe politically in China over the next 4 or 5 years. Watch this space. Something will give, something will happen. And I wouldn't be at all surprised if it brings Xi Jinping down, or at least there isn't a contest around his concept of leadership.
In the time Sir Richard Dearlove has been working in intelligence, China has gone from abject poverty to the world's greatest strategic power. Back when he was C, Dearlove was actually more focused on Russia.
How worried were you about China's potential biowarfare program when you were at the helm of MI6?
Because we were so much more worried about the Russian program at the time. And, a lot of the sort of driving factors between the OPCW negotiations came from our knowledge of the Russian program, on which we had significant details from defectors. I think we, made the assumption that there would be a parallel Chinese program, but given that I retired in 2004, the Chinese issue was not at the forefront of our minds during that period.
Sir Richard is one of many former intelligence officials who finds the evidence pointing to a lab leak overwhelming and compelling.
Well, I think the explanation is probably quite simple. That you have a created, fiercely infectious virus, which has been, as it were, adapted, engineered, whatever you like to call it, in a laboratory where the security was poor. Probably the idea that some of the staff become infected and then their families become infected seems to me, in my view, the most likely explanation for how it got out. And of course, once it's out of the bag and medical authorities in Wuhan don't really know what they're dealing with, initially at least, then suddenly it's too late. I think the one area perhaps I agree with the PRC leadership in Beijing is that knowing how communist parties function, the local communist leadership was probably very slow or too slow to reveal the seriousness of the problem that they had on their hands. Once the virus was gone from the lab, that was it.
What Really Happened in Wuhan is presented by The Australian. It's written and produced by me, Shari Markson, and The Australian's editorial director, Claire Harvey. It was produced by Leah Samaglu. My book, What Really Happened in Wuhan, is available online at Amazon, in bookstores in Australia at Dimox, or wherever you buy your books.